Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. On behalf of the Institute of Jewish Studies and the University Center St. Ignatius, Antwerp, UCSIA, a warm welcome to all of you to this 14th edition of the Chair for Jewish-Christian Relations, established jointly by UCSIA and the Institute of Jewish Studies in 2008. And I say this with quite some pride. I guess this is what one also can call sustainability. I would like to thank all those who have contributed to the establishment of the Chair for Jewish-Christian Relations, turning it into an important yearly event of our institutions. The Flemish Ministry of Education, which finances the Institute of Jewish Studies, and our partner in this endeavor, UCSIA, its director, Stan Lattre, and its academic advisor, Judith Gruber. I want to express my gratitude also to UCSIA's project coordinator, Hilke Kunst, and to the coordinator of the Institute of Jewish Studies, Jan Morens, for all the work that went into organizing this online event. The aim of the IJS Chair is to foster the study of Judaism and Hebraism from the perspective of Jewish-Christian dialogue in order to interpret its place in the contemporary European culture and to investigate its contribution to the interreligious dialogue. In Europe today, the Jewish-Christian relationship has gained a special function and topicality. The Jewish-Christian legacy, which over the centuries has known a turbulent and often tragic history, is often invoked today for the purposes of underscoring common principles and values, sometimes, or so the criticism goes, at the expense of other groups. The Chair of Jewish-Christian Relations established at this university is based on the conviction that it can be an inspiring expression of the current revival of interest in religions, precisely where its academic framework allows one to address the full complexity of interreligious relations. A focus on its history, achievements, and conflicts can more truly contribute to both authentic scholarship and a better understanding between different cultures, religions, and traditions. This 14th edition is dedicated to environmental ethics from a Jewish perspective. We are honored that Professor Ariel Mayse from Stanford University has already accepted our invitation to speak on this topic tonight. Environmental studies are not an obvious topic in Jewish studies. Erroneously, Judaism, considered as the monotheism that has fought against the pantheistic divinization of nature and arguably going for a subjection of nature, particularly of animals, to the needs of the human, starting from the divine commandment to name the animals, to make animal sacrifices, which actually signified the end of human sacrifices, as in the binding of Isaac, has often been considered adverse to a concern with the respect and preservation of nature and the environment. Tonight, we will hear about an alternative view of the relation to Judaism and the environment, a central topic in the humanities today. A response to Professor Mayse's lecture based on common Judeo-Christian and Christian sources will be brought forward by Professor Annemarie Meyer of Trier University. Professor Mayse and Professor Meyer, a warm welcome to you both. I'm looking forward to an inspiring and enriching evening, and I'm pleased to now give the floor to Professor Judith Gruber, who will introduce the theme and the speakers.
Vivian, thank you very much, and a warm welcome also from my side. I have the pleasure of welcoming you all on the behalf of UCSIA to this evening of dialogue, to this evening of engagement, to this evening that brings us together in the face of crisis, actually. And I'm very happy that we have that opportunity for conversation, for dialogue, for shared reflection. And as Vivian was sharing with us already, it is important to create such spaces and to make room for such spaces, especially in the memory and in remembrance of a longer history of problems. So on behalf of UCSIA, I have now the pleasure to welcome you to this evening, especially as we are in the face of these crises, imminent crisis. Of course, we're thinking of the war in Europe, of the war in the Ukraine that has started, but which is very much also just a symbol and a sign of more imminent crisis that we have been facing over the last few years with the pandemic, and the pandemic as a pinnacle perhaps of crisis, of which the environmental crisis, about which we will get into conversation today, is perhaps the baseline and the common theme of all that brings us together in a shared reflection on survival together. So something about reflection today that is a reflection in the imminent threat of how we can live in the face of endangered life. So I'm happy, but also I'm sensing the urgency of that conversation that we're having today. That urgency comes particularly to the fore when we think about kind of some of the landmarks, the parameters of the environmental crisis that we have to consider as we come together here to talk about it. The Living Planet Index, which assesses the state of biodiversity in the world's ecosystems, was found to be 30% lower in 2010 compared with 40 years ago in the 1970s. And in the ecological footprint of humankind has almost doubled since the mid-60s. So presently, humanity and the planet uses an equivalent of 1.5 planets in order to provide the resources that we consume and to also to absorb the wastes that we generate. And this use of planets is actually expected to increase to the equivalent of 2 planets by 2030, and to nearly 3 planets by 2050 if we keep on consuming in the same to the same extent. What's more, and we know all these figures, we have heard them often enough, fossil-based energy consumption and associated greenhouse gases are increasing at a high pace. And soon, again, if we keep on that track, will bring us to 2 degrees of global warming, which is really the threshold of threshold level of dangerous warming. So currently, in short, the world is running an ecological deficit with imminent crisis ahead. So what can we do, or what is to be done in the face of this crisis? Mary Evelyn Tucker writes, this crisis is not only a crisis that we can describe in terms of scientific numbers and status and figures, it is also and particularly a crisis of culture and of the human spirit. It is a moment of reconceptualizing the role of the human in nature. So overcoming the ecological crisis, or I would actually say dealing with the ecological crisis, will require radical changes in the way we humans relate to other humans and relate to non-human beings, and we relate to nature. And this question of relations actually leads us right into the terrain of ethics and theology. Ethics and theology become indispensable approaches for tackling the crisis we are finding ourselves in and that we have caused as well. And tonight, Professor Ariel Mayse will turn to a range of Jewish theological, legal, and philosophical literature to construct such an environmental ethics, one that counters the value of market individualism and extractivism with alternative narratives, with a different vision, and with theories of obligation towards the non-human world. So extending that vision that we have about ethics as well. He will show that rabbinic tort law can help us to conceive of thorny problems like distributive justice, collective action, cumulative pollution, and slow violence. Jewish creation narratives, he will show us, offer a vision for an integrated world, connected by sacred time and space that go beyond human instrumentalization. And so he will bring us to delve into mystic tradition that enables the cultivation of resilience and hope through contemplative interiority. Professor Mayse, I'm very happy, and I think we are all grateful that you will bring us on that journey tonight. And we are very glad you could join us from Stanford University. You joined the faculty there 4 years ago in 2017 as an assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies, after previously serving as the director of Jewish Studies and visiting assistant professor of modern Jewish thought at Hebrew College in Newton, Massachusetts. And you're also a research fellow at the Franklin Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies of the University of Michigan. Currently, you're also a fellow at the Kogod Research Center at Shalom Hartman Institute of Northern America. So you're engaged in a variety of institutions, and I think that also really shows the connectability of, and also the urgency of the work you bring today to the table. Professor Mayse holds a PhD in Jewish Studies from Harvard University and is an ordained rabbi from Beit Midrash Harel in Israel. Your research examines the role of language in Hasidism, manuscript theory, and the formation of early Hasidic literature. So really what you bring to the table here is a way of reading. And I think also as a Catholic theologian, it would be a reading of a signs of the times, I can say here. And this connected to the renaissance of Jewish mysticism in the 19th and 20th century, the relationship between spirituality and law in Jewish legal writings, and the resources of Jewish thought and theology for constructing contemporary environmental ethics. Professor Mayse, you have published widely on these themes. You are the author of, very recently, of Speaking Infinities, God and Language in the Teachings of Rabbi Dov Ber of Mesrich, and of another recent 2-volume work, which is called A New Hasidism, Roots and the New Hasidism Branches, that you published with Arthur Green. Your most recent book, I think, is really the one that is bringing the work here together, and it is entitled As a Deep River Rises, Judaism, Ecology, and Environmental Ethics, that is currently under contract with Brandeis University Press. Professor Mayse, very welcome again to UCSIA. We are very happy you're bringing us into conversation, and we look forward very much to your lecture, From Fracture to Flourishing, Jewish Law, Theology, and Environmental Ethics. Just a quick word, you will talk for about 35-40 minutes, and then I will introduce your respondent, Professor Maya, who will give your response, and that to the conclusion, there will be an opportunity to also have questions and to engage in conversation. So welcome again, and the floor is yours now.
Thank you all so much. My thanks to Professor Liska, to Dr. Latre, to Professor Gruber, to Hilka, to Jan, for all of your help in making this happen, for your kind invitations. I know it's often more difficult to arrange and execute an online panel like this. So I'm very, very grateful for this time. And thank you all for showing up this evening or this morning or this afternoon or whatever it is. My own background is not irrelevant to this story that I hope to tell this evening. I'm the native son of California. My parents were involved in agriculture and with organic farming and pest management, integrated non-chemical pest management at that, before these were cool. At the same time, growing up on a small farm, I watched the retreat of mountain snowpack, the precipitous decline in water, the enormous pollution of industrialized agriculture, the decline and disappearance of species that were once my friends. My earliest religious experiences were deep in the heart of the Sierra Nevada mountains. After my black belt test, on top of a frozen cliff, I learned that mountains can breathe and that we can breathe with them. So this evening, this afternoon, this morning, I'd like to invite you on a journey through the Jewish textual tradition, from the Bible to the medieval and early modern mystics, and also to contemporary philosophers whose names may be somewhat more familiar. We'll read some of these sources together. Others will provide the backdrop for my remarks, and you're invited to read them as I'm speaking or on your own time. I do always like to give my listeners some reading material to protect them against boredom. These are the sources with which I am grappling in order to understand our moment and what may be asked of us in this imperiled hour. You don't have to spend too long with the news to see that we live at a strange and very difficult time. I refer obviously to COVID, to the new war in Europe, and to something more, perhaps related to both. We live at a time of profound environmental consequence and reckoning. This is visible in extreme weather events, staggering loss of biodiversity, the depletion of fisheries, prolonged droughts, mass extinctions, and the pollution of air, water, and soil. The sixth assessment report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, including contributions from a working group released just last Sunday, have made these facts eminently clear. Some 3.3 to 3.6 billion people are at risk of catastrophic impact of human-induced climate change in the next few decades. Entire ecosystems are on the verge of collapse. And as part of these systems of life, we are on the verge of cataclysm as well. These facts amount to a crisis and should prompt us to rethink our ways of acting, our ways of thinking, and our ways of being in this world. Religion, I believe, has something very important to add to this conversation around the climate crisis. By this, I mean what religion brings to the table goes beyond the fact that religions are very good at motivating people to do things. I think that's an open question. There are lots of religious people in the world, hence the need to get them involved and motivated. There are a lot of religious people. I do not deny that. I am one of them. But religion has something else to share. Since the publication of Lynn White's famous essay on the historical roots of our ecological crisis, published in the late 1960s, many religious communities and scholars have been on the defensive. Some have doubled down on attempting to undercut the science that explains climate change. Many have taken a proactive tack to address these problems, but they do so often by searching for analogies. How do you say stewardship in Jewish, for example? Or by greenwashing the tradition with a thin veneer of environmental concern. See, my tradition has always been ecologically friendly. These approaches often do little more than to repeat established paradigms without offering alternative worldviews or ethical frameworks. To address these dire ecological problems, we need to now perform the deeper work of exploring traditional sources with an eye to alternative modes of theorization and valuation that can unseat assumptions about human beings and our relationship to the non-human world. On this point, religions can learn from one another, underscoring similarities, while also highlighting our own unique and different voices. Now, without romantically assuming that Jewish sources have all the answers needed to address staggeringly complicated issues, I wish to put these ideas in dialogue with the writings of contemporary thinkers and climate scientists in order to show that scholars, activists, and regulators ought to think with the texts of Jewish law, philosophy, and theology, in a sense, from a post-secular perspective. My question, you might say, is how do we read with new eyes in times of crisis? Here, I suggest that we think about these sources with two axes in mind. One is the eternal conversation between what is called halacha, Jewish law, and agadah, or theology. Judaism presents a robust normative system of obligations and rituals, but these injunctions and prohibitions are linked to a broader discourse of theological, philosophical, and intellectual meaning. This latter field shapes the formulation of Jewish law, ensuring that praxis reflects Judaism's deepest spiritual values. A second axis is that of science and religion. Scientific information and method are absolutely critical for understanding the mechanisms and implications of the climate crisis, as well as for helping to establish solutions. But at the same time, an ideology of science alone, something that is very much critiqued by Pope Francis in Laudato Si, an ideology of science alone can neither provide us with a robust ethical framework, nor can it help to dismantle the economic, philosophical, and social structures that dominate our world. These bodies of knowledge, law, spirit, science, and religion, rather than dichotomies, must be held together as mutually constructive and complementary forces. The first step in this journey, as I understand it, is not to rush to solutions. Recognize the situation for what it is, examining the current ecological travesty, the tragedies of mind and action that have led us to this situation as well. Judaism, for many complicated reasons, has deep resources for thinking through destruction, devastation, and rebirth. Rather than going to the 20th century, here I'm thinking about sources written many thousands of years ago. I begin with two biblical verses that grapple with the destruction of the temple. The first, voiced by the prophet Jeremiah, is a stinging indictment of those who could not conceive of destruction. Surely God won't bring down God's own house. This is the temple of the Lord, they say. And by refusing to acknowledge the frailty of that situation, these individuals could not address the root problems at the heart of the matter. The second, voiced by the author of the Book of Lamentations, bespeaks a yearning for redemption and deliverance even amid the devastation of the city of Jerusalem. Our eyes are trained upon, maybe we could call it, the deus ex machina of technological solutions. Will they be forthcoming? I doubt it. I turn now to the words of Maimonides, a great medieval jurist and theologian. He lives in the 12th and 13th centuries. Should also note he was an Aristotelian fellow traveler of Thomas Aquinas. Maimonides highlights the values of responsibility when we are confronted with difficult and even seemingly imponderable situations. Maimonides demands accounting for our actions, collective and personal, as the only ethical response to tragedy. Some versions of this theology might presume a naive cause and effect. My car was crushed under a tree, so I must have sinned. But on the other hand, Maimonides is calling us to remember the world around us is shaped by our actions. Fasting and repentance must be combined with a stock taking. If one does not do this, saying this is just the way of the world, Maimonides describes this as achzariut, as cruelty. Our actions shape our world. Here, on this note, I would commend to you the work of Kyle White, an American indigenous philosopher and climate activist, who describes two different ways of thinking about difficult situations. He has demonstrated the inadequacy of what he calls epistemologies of crisis for confronting climate change. When faced with seismic environmental shifts that threaten our ways of life, societies and their laws often fall back on those very same tools and structures that have brought them to that point. Kyle White presents an alternative in what he describes as epistemologies of coordination, namely, and here I quote, ways of knowing the world that emphasize the importance of moral bonds or kinship relationships for generating the responsible capacity to respond to constant change in the world, end quote. Coordination, in other words, is that which enables us to search for answers and response. Assuming that carbon emissions will not be dramatically diminished in the next few days, a datum that seems to be more and more sure with every passing moment, the question we need to ask is, how do we live together amid collapse? Like the Matsutake mushroom described by Anna Tsing in her marvelous book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, this fungus grows amid the rubble of devastated pine forests. We need to develop pathways of resilience. How do we go about creating this better world? Well, technology has a place, but it's not dispositive. The Jewish tradition is clear that technology is not the only answer. Carbon sequestering, terraforming, plastic vacuums, geoengineering. I live in the middle of Silicon Valley. This is all what people talk about. But these are not the only solution. At best, they treat the symptoms, and more often they reflect the deeper malaise. Judaism rejects what we might call technological determinism. Not everything that can be done ought to be done. Here too, I doff my hat to Pope Francis's remarks on technocracy and the naive over-adulation of science in his Laudato Si. I offer here two examples from the Jewish tradition. The first highlights the power of technology as a kind of graven or false god. This rabbinic teaching maps the yearning for technological mastery in order to stave off ecological calamity onto the story of the Tower of Babel, long identified as a tale warning against hubris. People get together, seeing that the floodgates of heavens are opening, and what do? They build a tower to try and prop it up, to hold back those tides, build higher, grow, hold up the heavens, create carbon sequestering systems, geoengineering, that's the technology. As if we can have an ever-expanding GDP somehow in a world of limited resources. We and some 95% of the species that have co-evolved with us across these past millennia cannot live on a planet that we are creating. The second text, and here, it's there just beneath the other one, is about the golem, one of those great Jewish legends that have made their way into popular culture, which is actually well attested in the Jewish legal tradition itself. The responsum, the text that you have in front of you tells the story of whether or not you can count a golem, this magically created creature, as a member of a prayer quorum. So the answer is no, kind of. You can't really do that. But at the very end, the author puts some chilling words onto the table. And he notes that when he tries to destroy the golem, this thing that had gotten so big that it had taken over and become, as it were, a life of its own, he tries to destroy it by erasing God's name off of the forehead. And as he does so, the golem reaches out and injures his own forehead. I take this text to be a warning against the reflexive hazards of the things that we create and begin not only to control us, but to impact us in ways that we have only begun to understand. In confronting brokenness, I find myself drawn to poetry. Who knows the broken heart better than the poet? Poetry can help us understand what scientific facts cannot. How to change narratives, how to open hearts. I find myself in particular drawn to the works of Zelda Schneerson-Mishkovsky, an Israeli poet born in Ukraine, whose work celebrates the miracle of the ordinary. The heroes of her poetry are fish, butterflies, and plants. A story recounted by Marcia Falk, a close friend of Zelda and her translator, into English. Marcia describes going to Zelda's house. She was sent by a group of poets who all wanted to know, what is the symbol of this fish? What is the symbol of this plant? What does it stand for? And Zelda says, I don't understand why people have to make things so complicated. Why is a plant that speaks any more miraculous than the plant growing on my windowsill? It's the miracle of the ordinary. The poem that you have before you here tells us somewhat of a dimmer, darker story. It's about the melting of snow, about grim men emerging to destroy the plants, creating ruins, the devastation of a landscape. The trees in Zelda's poem have interiority. They're responsive. They reach. They yearn. And yet, these grim individuals do not cut them down gently, respectfully, but they destroy wantonly. The epigram, spoken like in the words of a wide-eyed child, suggests that destroying a tree can be an act of murder. And just to highlight the Hebrew here, the child asks, is it permitted for a tree to be killed? The word laharog in Hebrew is the word to murder. It's not a word that you can use on a tree in normative language. It means murder. So the snows of our stable world, our planet, are melting, not just figuratively, but literally. And must more devastation emerge? The Hasidic mystics, and from here we pivot from brokenness to rebuilding, remind us that brokenness is where healing is to be found. The biblical story of Joseph has him going down into Egypt, not in spite of, but because there was work to be done there. Vayar Yaakov ki yeshever b'Mitzrayim. Jacob sees that there is food in Egypt. The Hasidic mystics read food, shever in Hebrew, as shvira, brokenness. Jacob sees, as it were, that there is brokenness in this particular place, and his child goes before him into that place, because that is where healing is to be found. We must then examine our economic, philosophical, and social systems, noting that the boat is adrift. In Bruno Latour's image, we're spinning off into space. Let us be frank about that brokenness, and let us have the courage to set it right. In order to do this work, we need better myths. We need what the Zohar, the crown jewel of medieval Jewish mysticism, calls milin chadatin atikin, old, new words. One potential, one possible myth is that of pantheism. God is everything. Or panentheism. God is everything and God is more. Maybe, like Lazarus, it's time to revive this pantheistic beast. All is God. Alles is Gott, says one Hasidic source from the early 19th century. Everything is divinity. Such myths leave no room for a human versus nature binary, or even perhaps a hierarchy. We're part of that economy of life, ecology, an economy of life and vitality and breath and sacred being, of circulated divinity that suffuses all aspects of the cosmos. It's the end of nature, not in Bill McKibben's sense of the reach of spoilage such that there is nothing left, but in Timothy Morton's sense that an external project called nature, this thing out there, must be overcome in order to understand how we are part of the integrated fabric of that world. how might we generate a toothsome ethic grounded in this way of looking at the world? The professor of religious studies and philosopher, Mary Jane Rubenstein, has suggested that pantheism reminds us that we must, quote, be nature better. How might an awareness that God is everywhere, expressed in all forms of life, as well as through the physical landscape itself, change our relationship to the non-human world? I pivot from that myth to that of the Zohar, a mystical work generated in the 13th century in Christian Iberia, a work of mythic, dynamic theology, of a God that is both immanent and transcendent, a divine that is in need of human action. The Zohar constantly emphasizes the role of human beings as the tender of a sacred well. Water, says the Zohar, in a metaphor for divine vitality, rushes into the cosmos at all times. Human beings are charged with funneling, channeling that blessing into our world. Elsewhere, the Zohar describes King Solomon as plucking the walnut off of a tree, contemplating the fruit in its many layers of shell and nut meat, coming to see that all forms of life are infinitely interrelated. The interrelationship of all elements of this world, the imbrication of garments are all linked together, inner and outer, without being hierarchical. Again, how might we generate a toothsome ethic grounded in this way of looking at the world? We live, as it were, in a garden that is constantly being fed by this infinite well of divine light, of divine water. We, however, have a part to play in ensuring the flow of that aquifer. In both of these myths, in the Zoharic myth of human action, in the pantheistic Hasidic vision of a world that is suffused with divinity, you might say that the world shimmers. Shimmering is a word that is highlighted by the late anthropologist Deborah Bird Rose, who's described the Yolngu Aboriginal word biryun, or brilliance, as that which, quote, allows you or brings you into the experience of being part of a vibrant and vibrating world, end quote. Biryun, brilliance, also means, here I quote once more, one's actual capacity to see and experience ancestral power. I should note that in many passages in the Zohar, the comrades, the mystical heroes of this narrative, arrive at a rock, at a tree, at a mountain. They encounter a donkey. Nothing interesting happens in the hall of study in the Zohar. It happens in the world in which everything is a prompt for reading anew. This river that we have encountered teaches us something about the Hebrew Bible, and the Hebrew Bible teaches us something about the river. There's a kind of reciprocity of exegesis that happens. The world shimmers. Now, modernity has taught us to see the world as stable. It's kind of an old Aristotelian trope connected to the pre-existence of the world that's given additional texture in the modern period. The Hasidic text that we saw earlier suggests that God is always remaking the world, perhaps raising the possibility that destruction is perhaps raising the idea that destruction could be possible. Rabbi Moshe Isserles in the 16th century actually wrote a book about how do you live a religious life with a vision of the world that's about to come to end. But you don't have to go to the 16th century to think about that. You can go to the Bible. In the Bible, and especially in the book of Leviticus. And I'm honored to see that amongst amongst the attendees here, we have Professor Nehemiah Poland, one of the great authorities on the book of Leviticus, who, in the purpose of full disclosure, is also my father-in-law. In the Bible and in the book of Leviticus, the land acts. We see this in the verses about the Sabbath, about the sabbatical year, about the way in which human beings are entrusted with the land. And although God commands it to do things, the land itself acts. This is a helpful model for thinking about what Isabella Stengers and Bruno Latour have described as the forceful interruption of Gaia, a power with which we must reckon and which we cannot control. We live in community with the land. But the land is not an object. It is a subject. The world, the land, may flex and act in response to our over-extraction from fracking to pit mining to industrialized agribusiness and massive air pollution. A 20th century Hasidic thinker goes even farther. Reading the Bible carefully, he notes that the rain that comes down on Noah and his ark is not commanded by God, it's all in the passive. The fountainheads open, the windows in heaven are brought open. He describes it as a hashtacha, as a consequence. It's a consequential flood. Breathing now. What are we to do? What are we to do? We must rethink the place of the human being. Earlier, I suggested that we need to get beyond the false dichotomy of human versus nature. Part of that is taking responsibility. We are the gardeners. Rather than conquering and subduing the land, as we always see in the quotations from the Hebrew Bible, you might say that we highlight the counter text in the second Genesis story, in which we are called to work and preserve the garden as a sacred trust. If that first story in the opening chapter of Genesis puts human beings within the creative hierarchy, the second, and that's the tale of the garden, imagines human beings within a terrestrial realm in which they are connected to the animals with a wisdom so great that they are charged with that holiest of actions, giving them names. One version of this story has God, here is a rabbinic teaching, one version of this story has God showing Adam all of the works of creation, reminding Adam that if he does not take care of it, no one else will. There's not another world to take its place. Another version of this comes to us from the writings of a 16th century mystic who describes in that same metaphor that we saw from the Zohar, human beings are the tenders of the garden and we are the shepherds of that river. Our actions matter. The concept of stewardship is often overused and treated as a kind of noblesse oblige, but on the other hand, it is a core value. We live in community with the land, in conversation with its inhabitants, and in a web of reciprocity and mutual obligation that is key to the divine charge. So here I suggest that the anthropocentric focus of Judaism is a feature. It's not a bug in the Anthropocene. Whether we start that age at 1492 or with the rise of colonialism or the first or the second industrial revolutions or the post-war atomic age, human beings are now shaping the world in ways that were unimaginable. We are not the only world-building creatures, of course, but we do it at scale and with a potential for destruction that is unique among the forms of life on this planet. There's a famous teaching that we can learn Torah from the animals. We look at the world around us and we can learn Torah. It's a beautiful idea. It kind of grates against me at the current moment, however, because it's still so human-centered. We learn our Torah from the animals. So too, a famous rabbinic teaching about King David not understanding why God created wasps and spiders until wasps and spiders helped him out of a tight situation. They saved him. And so now he understands God created them in order for me at my particular time of need. So we disregard the importance of something seemingly insignificant until we figure out what use they are to us. That is not the only voice of this tradition. Here, I highlight the voice of the book of Job, which wonders and invites us to wonder about the uniqueness of animal life. The horse, the ostrich, the goat, and the wild ox. These animals exist. The horse, horses, the goat, goats, the ox, oxes, and we only witness their mystery. If we were to rewrite then that rabbinic teaching about the Torah, learning Torah from the animals, we'd ask, what is the Torah of cats, the Torah of the ants, the Torah of the dove, the Torah of the rooster? What is the sacred teaching that comes to us from the Umwelt, from the way of looking at the world that those particular creatures have? Maimonides argued already in the 13th century. The world is not just here for our pleasure. All things exist for their own reasons, not because it depends purely on human beings. Jacques Derrida noted that animal is a stupid word. It's a word that makes us stupid, feeding our ego-driven conception of humanity as the summit of creation and essentially dividing us from all other non-human forms of life. Judaism may recognize, and indeed it does, that people have a special power and a special place, but this is nested within a much broader array of kinship relationships. Here's a source from the 19th century, a Hasidic thinker from the world of Poland, who I suspect had begun to see the impact of industrialization, of the chopping down of Polish forests to build railroads. He daringly reads the statement, "Let us make the human being in our image," a confusing statement. He reads it not as the royal we, or as God speaking to the angels, but as God speaking to every created being, asking whether or not humans should be created. Why? Because we can destroy it all. The sum totality of the symphony of creation, in all of its polyphonic richness, in its biodiversity, God asks all of that, whether or not human beings are to be created. And so, with their permission comes, we might say, a kind of pre-ontological, that which comes before creation and before being, a pre-ontological commitment, an obligation to the infinite richness of biodiversity. But we don't encounter all of that at every moment. Orientation, engagement, all of this begins with a single moment of encounter. Maybe a butterfly, maybe a tree. If any of you have spent time with Martin Buber's I and Thou, his example of the I-Thou encounter starts with a tree. You can also find that in the rabbinic tradition, in which someone who gains from a tree, who enjoys the tree, who enjoys its shade, asks by what he may bless it, with what he may bless it. And rather than saying it must be this or it must be that, he says, may all of your saplings, may your progeny be like you. And so through that quality of engenderment, he blesses the tree on its own terms. The tree is blessed to continue to tree. As I begin to wrap toward a conclusion here, I would like to say that Jewish tort law offers a powerful language for ethics that is founded in obligation. This is an insight from the legal philosopher Robert Cover, who notes that Jewish law, unlike American common law, is rooted in obligations rather than rights. Here I should note that the Europeans do it better. You have a sense of obligations as a social fabric that is much, much deeper than what you find in the American common law tradition. This obligation mindset, and here I would encourage us all to take it farther, offers a missing language for current discourse regarding climate change and the impending disaster. Here I quote from Amitav Ghosh: "In that global warming poses a powerful idea, challenge to the idea that the free pursuit of individual interests always leads to the common good, it also challenges a set of beliefs that underlies a deep-rooted cultural identity, one that has enjoyed unparalleled success over the past 2 centuries, namely the individual moral adventure as the root of our action." Obligations-based jurisprudence provides a framework for shifting from a starting point of technological capacity and economic advancement to one that focuses on the capacity of institutions and human actors that keeps pace with our ability to impact and harm the biosphere. Industry, of course, isn't forbidden by Jewish law, and businesses, even businesses that create a certain amount of noise, air, or water pollution. But communities are meant to be livable and sustainable for both human and non-humans. And Talmudic sources demonstrate a careful calculus that balances economic productivity with collective flourishing. Here, the second source is a reflection of what corrosive industries might have looked like in a pre-modern society. They're building a ziggurat. I can only assume that's what it is because it's described as a kind of tower with steps on both sides. And when people fall into the pit at the center, they don't care, they continue. But when a brick falls, everyone cries and they stop the production line. It is not a far cry from that to the meatpacking plants of America and to other kinds of industrialized production all over the world. We sometimes cry more when we have to stop the vicious efficiency of our machines of construction. I've spent a lot of time over the past few years developing 3 primary categories for conceptualizing environmental damage and the cost of human life that comes along with it in Jewish sources. The first of these is called Aish, or fire, which is a category of tort, a category of damage that covers all forces that are immovable and foreseeable, forces that go out into the world and cause damage. A second, bor, which means pit, covers all non-movable cumulative forces. If I dig a pit and someone else digs a pit, we're both held liable for the damage it causes. So it accounts here for cumulative and multiple causes of damage. Philosophers and climate scientists describe something called slow violence, which is done to communities not even over one generation, but sometimes over multiple generations. It's very hard to conceive of as a tort within the American legal system. Here, however, we have a language for not only multiple causality, but cumulative damage. And a third category has to do with the damages that we are allowed to or not allowed to cause to our neighbors. One cannot externalize damage to others, to the world, just as the cost of doing business according to Jewish law. You have to take account of it. Together, these outline major toothsome prohibitions on, well, let's think, coal, smoke, open pit mining, unchecked radiation, plastic pollution, deforestation, human-induced and exacerbated wildfires, as well as a host of extractive and corrosive actions that yield the wicked harvest. But we need to think about these on a global scale, understanding that economic concerns cannot be given ultimate authority. They should, these categories, remind us of the remarks of Antonio Guterres in response to the most recent IPCC report. The world's biggest polluters are guilty of arson of our only home. Remember that one of these categories of damages was fire. To these, I'd add one fourth category, which is hashivat aveda, or returning lost objects, a biblical obligation spelled out in 2 places. Security, says the Hebrew Bible, expanded in the rabbinic tradition, is something that you owe to other human beings, and you must fight to protect it for them. Environmental collapse will yield, and in fact is already yielding major human costs. Remember, 3.3 to 3.6 billion people will be impacted by this. Climate refugees are a fact. Here you have a source about more people dying from drinking the water of the Euphrates River than were killed during the war that destroyed the first temple. Exiles, those cast out of their land by war, are often killed more by disease, but also by the inability of others or the unwillingness of others to help them. So from amid fracture, we can yet come to flourishing that does not come at the expense of others, not about consumption, but about blossoming, internal and external. That's what I mean by flourishing. Sometimes we need to experience the brokenness in order to rise up and to reconfigure our ways of being. Said Václav Havel, there are times when we must sink to the bottom of our misery to understand truth, just as we must descend to the bottom of a well to see the stars in broad daylight. We need halakha. We need obligation. We need toothsome ethics. But we also need agadah, theology, and myth. We need science, and we need religion, and we need each other. In local communities, in communities of faith, and across lines and intersections of identity, we need to give others the gift of opening our hearts and working together. To be rooted in a place is to see one's children and grandchildren inhabit that place. Maybe that's Antwerp, maybe it's Europe, maybe it's Berkeley, maybe it's the ancestral lands of the Mwekma Ohlone peoples who lived here, but it's certainly the earth. It's our common home, said Pope Francis, our only home. When in doubt, Judaism teaches, do as God does. Plant trees. Not just physical trees. Plant ideas that will grow. Plant moments of connection that will foster rhizomatic connections that spread out. Let us turn to our lawmakers and insist on moral action. Let us turn to our leaders and demand justice above profits. Let us call for action, not rhetoric. Let us take responsibility for our actions. Let us seek new old myths to complement scientific information, and let us remember the power of obligation founded in connection. Let us turn to these deep wells of tradition in order to go from fracture to flourishing. Thank you.
Professor Mayse, thank you very, very much for your old new words, for guiding us through a whole country, a whole terrain of old new words, and for showing us ways from these old new words for flourishing, and I would say in the midst of fractures. So flourishing that takes us into the fractures, does not ignore the fractures, but flourishing that arises from these cracks very much, and flourishing that is communal flourishing, communal both in the sense of globe spanning, but also intergenerational flourishing, and how these words are actually deeds, how these words are actually leading to actions. So thank you very much for this journey. Without further ado, I would like actually to introduce Professor Mayse, who will give a response to this journey, to your old new words. We have the privilege today of having Professor Mayse among us, who will respond to this lecture. Professor Mayse is Professor of Dogmatics and the History of Dogma at the Faculty of Catholic Theology of Trier, Germany. And I'm very, very happy to be able to welcome you here online in Antwerpen, because I had the privilege of working with Annemarie for the last few years when she was a professor of systematic theology at the at KU Leuven, at the Faculty of Theology at KU Leuven, where she was holding the chair Theology, Religion, and Contemporary Culture. Professor Mayse, so I know her teaching well, I know her research well, and I feel we are very privileged now to listen to your response, Annemarie. Welcome very much. Your teaching and your research focuses on the interrelation of theology, religion, and contemporary culture, as well as on ecclesiology, ecumenical hermeneutics, and the history of interreligious dialogue. Between 2011 and 2017, you were a member of the International Reformed Catholic Dialogue, and you did that, you filled that position as the only Catholic woman worldwide. And that dialogue initiative led to the World Communion of Reformed Churches to affiliate with the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification in 2017. So a successful initiative in dialogue. Since 2010, Professor Mayse is part of the joint working group between the World Council of Churches and the Roman Catholic Church. Since she moved to Belgium, she's also she became a co-opted member of the Commission Nationale Catholique pour l'Ecumenisme of the Belgian Bishops' Conference. Because of her interreligious interests, Professor Mayse was also a member of the Vatican delegation to the Second Catholic Muslim Forum in Jordan in 2011, of the Islamic Catholic Liaison Committee in 2013, and then also of the delegation of the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue to the University of Al-Azhar to Cairo in 2016. Until 2013, she was the Catholic consultant at the World Council of Churches in Geneva, and where she also taught fundamental theology at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. Until 2010, she taught at the Institute for Ecumenical Research ecumenical research at the Catholic faculty of the University of Tübingen and at the University of Stuttgart-Hohenheim, Germany. A lot of academic positions as well, and a journey of through academic institutions here as well. She was the editor-in-chief of Louvain Studies, published by Peters, and one of the academic editors of the International Journal for the Study of the Christian Church, and she's currently co-editor of the open access online journal Religions. Annemarie, Professor Mayse, I'm very, very happy to welcome you here as the respondent, and I'm very happy now to hear that response as well to Professor Mayse. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. And dear colleague, dear Professor Mayse, thanks a lot for this very rich and inspiring contribution to which I have the honor to respond. I will take up some of your ideas and first focus on what Jews and Christians have in common, then sketch some specifically Christian emphasis, let's put it like that, and thirdly, concentrate on the encyclical Laudato Si, which you already quoted or referred to a few times by Pope Francis, to show where the two religions, Judaism and Christianity, converge these days. Our two religions do not only share a book, which we Christians call the Old Testament, and which, if we want to put it poetically, is experience coagulated into a written text, experience of creation and experience of God. We also share the accusations made against the Judeo-Christian understanding of creation, most often based on the interpretation of Bereshit bara, or Genesis 1:28, God's call to human beings to fill and subdue the earth. As you can see, I was looking for my rusty Hebrew to give you at least a quotation also in Hebrew. As early as 1972, Karl Annemarie, a German writer and environmental activist, wrote in The End of Providence, and I quote here, "The destruction of nature by man creates the possibility that the history of salvation will turn into a history of ultimate horror. Yet, as we have already seen, this understanding falls short, for one must take into account the breadth, the whole breadth of creation theological statements, both in the Bible and beyond. Ariel Mayse just gave us a tour d'horizon, what there is in Judaism about that. In the Bible itself, there are texts like Psalm 109, that praise the Creator on the basis of his creation, or texts like Job 38, which we just saw, that emphasize God's supremacy and human powerlessness. Moreover, the well-known creation narratives at the beginning of the Bible must be seen in the context of their time. In the ancient Oriental myths of creation, we read that human beings are created to work as slaves for the gods, or they are created as a result of bloody conflicts, stem from the remains of defeated gods, and have to serve the dominant gods to satisfy their hunger for power. In comparison, the first biblical account of creation, with its emphasis on the orderliness of creation, wants to protect life and guide it in orderly ways. It seeks to enable and preserve life and characterizes creation in general as good. In the second creation narrative, human beings and animals are not only created on the same day, as we already had it in the first creation narrative, but they are even made of the same material, soil. From this common origin, a deep creative connectedness arises. Yet for understanding creation in the Old Testament, one must not stop reading after the first 2 chapters of Genesis. Actually, it's only after the flood with Genesis chapter 9 that we arrive at a reality as it was experienced then and still is today. A creation that has fallen and is threatened. This is, and that's very important, theologically speaking, where hope begins, as witnessed to in the book of Jeremiah, for instance, chapters 65, 66, where, just to quote that, for I am about to create new heavens and a new earth. And that also is taken up in the book of Revelation in the New Testament, 21:1. So if we ask now, what characterizes a specific Christian understanding of creation, we can state the following. Jesus sees creation as a mirror of the Creator in which God's fatherly care shines up. Creation stands between already and not yet, between life and happiness that can already be experienced on one hand, and the deep longing on the other that grows out of the suffering and the wounds of creation. Paul spells this out and understands the Christians themselves as a new creation. The future puts the present in a different light. So Paul writes, for neither circumcision nor uncircumcision is anything, but a new creation is everything. For Paul, the insight into God's plan of creation can only mean to already now walk in newness of life, he writes in Romans 6:4. And thus to participate in the building of this new creation. The goal of all creation transcends the human capacity. So salvation is coming to humankind and to all creation. Completion is given to them. And yet also human efforts are required. At no point in the New Testament, passivity is advocated. So according to Christian faith, God enters into his creation. God becomes man. He lives in the world in a solitary and selfless way, sensitive to the suffering and longing of all creatures. heals the sick, and proclaims the coming of God's kingdom. In an exemplary gesture, he kneels down and washes feet, gives food, and in the end, even allows himself to be crucified. This gesture, so to speak, sums up Jesus's entire life. At the end of the foot washing in John's Gospel, Jesus says, "For I have set you an example, that you also should do as I have done to you." So the New Testament is very realistic about creation. It knows about creation's beauty and imperfection. It praises creation and suffers with it. Faith does not overlook the brokenness of creation, but it sees it differently. Paul speaks of birth pangs in Romans 8. This does not take away from life any pain, but it is an invitation to interpret life and the world differently, with faithful eyes and without having to conceal anything. The New Testament sees our human responsibility for creation holistically. As important and crucial as avoiding waste, reducing pollution, and ending the deforestation of the rainforest are, there is a far more complex perspective at stake. It is about preserving nature while being fully aware of its character as creation. This is not only about single behaviors, it is about a basic attitude. Already in Jesus' proclamation, the love of nature is connected with the commandment to love one's enemies. Those who believe in a creator see themselves as creatures and not as the sole rulers. Those who suffer with creation declare solidarity with all creatures. Can one honestly plant trees and cut off one's neighbor's water of life? It is a matter of addressing root sins that have upset the balance and harmed the environment. An indispensable part of environmental protection are attitudes and values, such as modesty, self-sufficiency, renunciation of profit, considerativeness, and love of one's neighbor. Paul sums up this attitude in his letter to the Philippians. If then there is any encouragement in Christ, any consolation from love, any sharing in the Spirit, any compassion and sympathy, make my joy complete. Be of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Let the same mind be in you that was in Jesus Christ. Can we still talk about values like these today without appearing outmoded? Well, Pope Francis did so in 2015, just before the climate summit in Paris. In his encyclical letter, Laudato Si, he addressed the entire humankind with an urgent call to protect creation. The Pope followed in the footsteps of Saint Francis of Assisi, a medieval mystic and friar who lived around the time of Maimonides, and as we just heard, also at the time when the Zohar was written. So Pope Francis uses the Saint's Canticle because he believes, and I brought you that quote, that Saint Francis is the example par excellence of care for the vulnerable and of an integral ecology lived out joyfully and authentically. Our sister, Mother Earth, now cries out, writes the Pope, to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. The Pope appeals to all humankind to protect our common home and to seek a sustainable and integral development. He insists that we need a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. We need a conversation which includes everyone. since the environmental challenge we are undergoing and its human roots concern and affect us all. I give you here an overview. I can't really go into details, but the encyclical comprises 6 chapters and 2 prayers. And the interesting bit certainly is that these 2 prayers is one from a Christian side, so a Christian prayer in union with creation, but the other one is an interreligious prayer that was formulated in a way that all members of religions together can actually pray it. The key paragraph of the encyclical is number 16, where the Pope mentions some transversal themes that will pop up again and again. He points out the intimate relationship between the poor and the fragility of the planet. So he says actually there is no big cleavage, no big gap between an ethical approach that takes care of the poor, also poor human being, and an ethical approach that focuses on environmental ethic. Pope identifies excessive anthropocentrism as the core problem. He pleads instead for an integral ecology that takes into account the interrelatedness of all life on the planet. So just to give you this last quote, as believers, the Pope emphasized, we do not look at the world from without, but from within, conscious of the bonds with which the Father has linked us to all beings. By developing our individual God-given capacities, an ecological conversion can inspire us to greater creativity and enthusiasm in resolving the world's problems. We do not understand our superiority as a reason for personal glory, irresponsible dominion, but rather as a different capacity, which in its turn entails a serious responsibility stemming from our faith. So here you see that's the answer of what Annemarie actually told us, that it's the fault of the Judeo-Christian understanding of creation. The theme of creation and the issue of preserving the environment can become an interreligious bridge, even a universal bond. It opens up the opportunity to discover common ground, to jointly take responsibility and to deal responsibly with each other and with creation. So on 4th October 2021, faith leaders representing the world's major religions joined scientists at the Vatican to call on the international community to raise their ambition and step up their climate action ahead of the UN Climate Change Conference COP26 in November in Glasgow. Almost 40 faith leaders signed a joint appeal, which was presented by Pope Francis to COP26 President-designate, the Right Honorable Alok Sharma, and the Italian Minister for Foreign Affairs, Luigi Di Maio. Signatories of this appeal include high-profile representatives from across the Christian denominations, from Judaism, both Sunni and Shia Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Zoroastrianism, and Jainism, representing a broad range of faith leaders. As you can see, if you go to the YouTube video, this is a video from Al Jazeera, so not from the Vatican on its own summit, right? So it could actually be something from outside. I would like to just end with part of the prayer for the earth that ends, so the last but one prayer of Laudato Si, just with a part of it. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it. We may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature. As we journey towards our infinite light, we thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much for two absolutely wonderful talks, moving, intelligent, important, even urgent. I want to thank both of you, and since Annemarie, I know that you have to go soon, I would like to invite the two of you, Ariel first, and then Annemarie, if you have a very brief statement to make to each other before we open the floor. And even then we will not have much time, but we will have time for a few questions. So Ariel, please.
Thank you, Annemarie. Thank you for such a stunningly beautiful presentation and for highlighting the shared both roots and lineage and common ground of our traditions. You know, one thing that struck me as you were speaking is that there is a key distinction here, and I think that here Judaism and Christianity are complementary in powerful ways, in between Judaism's unflagging emphasis on obligation, often in material and action-oriented ritual terms, but not in the impoverished sense of ritual, but ritual in the expansive sense. Whereas for many of the Christian sources, the cultivation of virtue and from virtue action with the virtue ethic is so strong. And I'm wondering, do you see Pope Francis's Laudato Si as a continuation of the virtue ethic, or is there also something that is deeply action-oriented of that particular text?
Well, I actually showed the overview, and there are some very important points. There's actually a whole chapter, the 4th chapter, on the action points to take. But the idea is that you don't just take individual actions and after a certain time, you don't recall that you still should care for creation. You should actually not litter all your environment or stuff like that. But the idea is that if you have this attitude, and that's actually then an attitude that's fostered by the values that you embrace. If you have that attitude, it will be no obligation to do it. It will come naturally to you. It will just be your way of living your life in you are not someone who is mentally split and has two different identities. So on Sunday you go to church and say, I want to be a good Christian. I am going to do all what the Pope actually suggests. And then from Monday to Friday, you work in one of these companies that pollute the whole earth, right? So this would be a little bit stupid. So it's much easier to put into action if you have this value background, if you embrace that as well. I think that's the reason also why Pope Francis was going back to St. Francis of Assisi, because that was exactly his revelation. He was a young man, very rich, actually someone who could have lived in a lot of luxury. And now he changed his whole world of values in order to be able to live in the way that actually would do a lot of good and would be the one that God expects of human beings. If I may point out my remark.
Yes.
I was very touched actually by the, let's say, the parallelism for ages, for centuries, where Jews and Christians somehow were advocating the same thing, but since they were not in such a habit of interreligious dialogue, they were not normally knowing it from each other. They did, then it was something they wouldn't really boast of. They would say, okay, Christians would say, we go back to the Old Testament. Yes, but for us, it's the Old Testament. So we have a new one. So let's look into the new one, what's in there. But actually, if you look very closely, you see that it's an ongoing tradition. It's just one red thread of one tradition and the other one. And that's what I find so inspiring also in your text, that you actually managed to make the connections every now and then. You mentioned Laudato Si at least 4 times, if I counted correctly. And that actually shows that it's not like 2 rails going parallel without any intersections, but that these intersections are actually keeping the flow of tradition alive. And I think that's where we need to aim at, to see that in a similar way.
Thank you so much. Part of the reason that I come back to Laudato Si so often is that my own thinking was shaped so much by watching the potential of someone who sits in the 21st century and is willing to rethink, not always in radical ways, but often in radical ways, something very deep about their own religious tradition. I found that to be such a tremendous demonstration of moral, ethical, spiritual, and religious courage. Judaism and Christianity, our traditions are a double helix, and sometimes it's a complicated relationship, and there are many points of historical connection in which we do exchange ideas, often in the form of polemics, often in the form of complicated interactions together with Aquinas, quoting Rabbi Moses Moses Maimonides, as someone who also gets it from a religious perspective. And I guess one of my great joys about the post-secular moment is that we can begin to think in individual terms about what various religious traditions have and what they can bring to the table, without falling into the sort of trap of, oh, well, look, they all say the same thing, and isn't it nice? We shouldn't litter and things like that. There is something powerful about the Christian virtue ethic, which is so different than the Jewish emphasis on an action orientation. And in that, I think that there is almost, you might say, a sort of like I'm not sure exactly how to put it, but a sort of a post-isolationist way in which the religious traditions teach one another, both through comparison and also through the power of contrast and through conversation. And that's something that is unique in our 21st century moment. And if we are to act on a collective scale, those are the conversations that need to be transpiring.
Ariel, that was wonderfully put. Annemarie, I know that you have to leave. Would you allow for a question or two, or do you have to run off?
Yes, please. And I would also want to ask people to put questions
in the chat.
Of us. Yes, exactly. Or in the chat, that would be a good idea. If you have already pre-typed questions.
So Marcel asks, and he has said this to me, to what extent do you think that either action or virtue has the further reach, is more effective? Now, of course, the term of efficiency is itself very specific, and I wonder where you situate it. I do have a question of my own as well, but maybe you want to reply to that one first. Yes.
I would say that efficiency is, or whether it's virtue ethic or action-oriented ethic, is also a question of the mindset. So if you grew up in a value-oriented environment, ethical environment, then this might actually be rather the one you want to stick to. So it, according to me, it really depends quite a bit on the background you are used to. And then it also is a question of whether you are in the habit of living out your convictions. So if it's a virtue ethic, then you would certainly, you can then become a Carthusian monk and never join the world again. Although this doesn't matter, this doesn't mean that they don't do anything for protecting the environment, for protecting creation, because they all live on their own, they have their little gardens, they don't pollute the environment and so on. But if you want to have a big outreach, then you better not choose a contemplative life. Then you better lead some public life, you become a teacher or do something where you have an influence on others and can hand this down in a direct way. That would be my take of it.
Thank you, Annemarie. Since I don't see other questions in the chat and we really have to finish in 3 minutes, I take the liberty to ask a last and probably rather controversial question. If I heard you two properly, and I find both talks really superb, but if I heard you properly right now, toward the end in your brief confrontation, Ariel, you would rather stress the, let's say, the right to think differently. And Annemarie, you would probably rather stress the commonalities, the harmony. And my question is, do you think that that in itself is intrinsic to each of your traditions? And do you think that there where you insist on specificity and distinction, does it go hand in hand with the respect of the other, while the stress on harmony would risk co-option of the other, or would it be the other way around? Now, I sure such a wonderful evening. I don't want to end it on, bringing up controversies, but as I announced in my opening words, we run this for the 14th time now with a clear view of both commonalities and differences, and therefore this final question. Just a few words from each of you. Annemarie, maybe you want to start.
Well, I would say the situation these days is such that we actually need to join forces to get, so there is no place for confrontation. If we now waste a lot of time with confrontation, that's my take, although it's to a certain extent certainly absolutely legitimate to think in different ways, right? But if we now waste too much time for confrontation instead of joint action, I think then it might already now be too late, but there is still a tiny little hope that if all believers worldwide were to work together, no matter whether they really normally like each other or not, whether Jews and Christians get along or Christians and Muslims get along or whatsoever. So it's no time anymore to look at these differences. We need to care for our common home. That's, I think that emphasis is very clear.
Beautiful, Annemarie. Thank you very much. Ariel, you as the speaker of the evening, you have the last word, a few words, please.
Thank you. I'm sure something about my protection of specificity has to do with Jewish experiences of being a minority, of supersessionist rhetoric, on many different fronts. So I'm sure there's some of it. It also has to do with being an academic and trying to find differences. You know, I have another career as a rabbi where it's a little bit different. On the other hand, this is really deep into my own psyche in that I think that we can, and Annemarie, this I think dovetails with what you were saying, we can join forces without effacing difference.
Yes.
It requires us to admit that we don't have all of the answers. And just as you said, we need to work together. The problems are intractable unless we do. But I would say that collective action is possible while still respecting, acknowledging, and enjoying the rich biodiversity of religious life.
Wonderful. I don't want to add anything to this except have a wonderful evening and thank you so, so much. The two speakers, it was wonderful. One of those happy moments for a director of an institute. And I have the feeling for all of us here. So many, many thanks.
Thank
And
you.
I hope we will eventually meet in person.
I look forward
Yes,
to that very
yeah.
much.
Let's hope for
Good
that.
evening.
Exactly. Good evening.
Good evening.